CHAPTER IX of Daniel Boone. This recording is in the public domain. Allyson Hester. CHAPTER IX. Victories and Defeats. There were but 50 men in the garrison at Boonesborough. They were assailed by a body of more than 10 to 1 of the bravest Indian warriors, under the command of an officer in the British army. The boldest in the fort felt their situation was almost desperate. The ferocity of the Indian, and the intelligence of the white man, were combined against them. They knew that the British commander, however humane he might be, would have no power, should the fort be taken by storm, to save them from death by the most horrible tortures. General Duquesne was acting under instructions from Governor Hamilton, the British officer in supreme command at Detroit. Boone knew that the governor felt very kindly towards him. When he had been carried to that place a captive, the governor had made very earnest endeavors to obtain his liberation. Influenced by these considerations, he consented to hold the conference. But better acquainted with the Indian character than perhaps Duquesne could have been, he selected 9 of the most athletic and strong of the garrison, and appointed the place of meeting in front of the fort, at a distance of only 120 feet from the walls. The riflemen of the garrison were placed in a position to cover the spot with their guns, so that in case of treachery the Indians would meet with instant punishment, and the retreat of the party from the fort would probably be secured. The language of Boone is: "We held a treaty within 60 yards of the garrison, on purpose to divert them from a breach of honor, as we could not avoid suspicion of the savages." The terms proposed by General Duquesne were extremely liberal, and while they might satisfy the British party, whose object in the war was simply to conquer the colonists and bring them back to loyalty, they could by no means have satisfied the Indians, who desired not merely to drive the white men from their hunting grounds, but to plunder them of their possessions, and to gratify their savage natures by hearing the shrieks of their victims at the stake, and by carrying home the trophies of numerous scalps. Boone and his men, buried in the depths of the wilderness, had probably taken little interest in the controversy which was just then rising between the colonies and the mother country. They had regarded the King of England as their lawful sovereign, and their minds had never been agitated by the question of revolution or of independence. When therefore General Duquesne proposed that they should take the oath of allegiance to the King of Great Britain, and that then they should be permitted to return unmolested to their homes and their friends beyond the mountains, taking all their possessions with them, Colonel Boone and his associates were very ready to accept such terms. It justly appeared to them in their isolated condition, 500 miles away from the Atlantic coast, that this was vastly preferable to remaining in the wilderness assailed by thousands of Indians, guided by English energy, and abundantly provided with all the munitions of war from British arsenals. But Boone knew very well that the Indians would never willingly assent to this treaty. Still he and his fellow commissioners signed it, while very curious to learn how it would be regarded by their savage foes. The commissioners on both sides had appeared at the appointed place of conference, as is usual on such occasions, entirely unarmed. There were, however, a large number of Indians lingering around and drawing nearer as the conference proceeded. After the treaty was signed, the old Indian chief Blackfish, Boone's adopted father, and who, exasperated by the escape of his ungrateful son, had been watching him with a very unamiable expression of countenance, arose and made a formal speech in the most approved style of Indian eloquence. He commented upon the bravery of the two armies, and of the desirableness that there should be entire friendship between them, and closed by saying that it was a custom with them on all such important occasions to ratify the treaty by 2 Indians shaking hands with each white man. This shallow pretense, scarcely up to the sagacity of children, by which Blackfish hoped that 2 savages grappling each one of the commissioners would easily be able to make prisoners of them, and then by threats of torture compel the surrender of the fort, did not in the slightest degree deceive Colonel Boone. He was well aware of his own strength, and of that of the men who accompanied him. He also knew that his riflemen occupied concealed positions from which, with unerring aim, they could instantly punish the savages for any act of treachery. He therefore consented to the arrangement. The grasp was given. Instantly a terrible scene of confusion ensued. The burly savages tried to drag off their victims. The surrounding Indians rushed in to their aid, and a deadly fire was opened upon them from the fort, which was energetically responded to by all the armed savages from behind stumps and trees. One of the fiercest of battles had instantly blazed forth. Still these stalwart pioneers were not taken by surprise. Aided by the bullets of the fort, they shook off their assailants, and all succeeded in escaping within the heavy gates, which were immediately closed behind them. One only of their number, Boone's brother, was wounded. This escape seems almost miraculous, but the majority of the Indians in intelligence were mere children, sometimes very cunning, but often with the grossest stupidity mingled with their strategy. Duquesne and Blackfish, the associated leaders, now commenced the siege of the fort with all their energies. Dividing their forces into two parties, they kept up an incessant fire upon the garrison for 9 days and 9 nights. It was one of the most heroic of those bloody struggles between civilization and barbarism, which have rendered the plains of Kentucky memorable. The savages were very careful not to expose themselves to the rifles of the besieged. They were stationed behind rocks and trees and stumps, so that it was seldom that the garrison could catch even a glimpse of the foes who were assailing them. It was necessary for those within the fort to be sparing of their ammunition. They seldom fired unless they could take deliberate aim, and then the bullet was almost always sure to reach its mark. Colonel Boone, in describing this attempt of the Indians to capture the commissioners by stratagem, and of the storm of war which follows, writes: "They immediately grappled us, but, although surrounded by hundreds of savages, we extricated ourselves from them and escaped all safe into the garrison, except one, who was wounded through a heavy fire from their army. They immediately attacked us on every side, and a constant heavy fire ensued between us, day and night, for the space of 9 days. In this time the enemy began to undermine our fort, which was situated about 60 yards from the Kentucky River. They began at the water mark, and proceeded in the bank some distance, which we understood by their making the water muddy with the clay. We immediately proceeded to disappoint their design by cutting a trench across their subterranean passage. The enemy, discovering our countermine by the clay we threw out of the fort, desisted from that stratagem. Experience now fully convincing them that neither their power nor their policy could effect their purpose, on the 20th of August they raised the siege and departed. During this siege, which threatened death in every form, we had 2 men killed and 4 wounded, besides a number of cattle. We killed of the enemy 37, and wounded a great number. After they were gone, we picked up 125 pounds weight of bullets, besides what stuck in the logs of our fort, which certainly is a great proof of their industry. It is said that during this siege, one of the negroes, probably a slave, deserted from the fort with one of their best rifles, and joined the Indians. Concealing himself in a tree, where unseen he could take deliberate aim, he became one of the most successful assailants. But the eagle eye of Boone detected him, and though, as was afterwards ascertained by actual measurement, the tree was 525 feet distant from the fort, Boone took deliberate aim, fired, and the man was seen to drop heavily from his covert to the ground. The bullet from Boone's rifle had pierced his brain. At one time the Indians had succeeded in setting fire to the fort by throwing flaming combustibles upon it, attached to their arrows. One of the young men extinguished the flames, exposing himself to the concentrated and deadly fire of the assailants in doing so. Though the bullets fell like hailstones around him, the brave fellow escaped unscathed. This repulse quite disheartened the Indians. Henceforth they regarded Boonesborough as a Gibraltar, impregnable to any force which they could bring against it. They never assailed it again. Though Boonesboro is now but a small village in Kentucky, it has a history which will render it forever memorable in the annals of heroism. It will be remembered that Boone's family, supposing him to have perished by the hands of the Indians, had returned to the home of Mrs. Boone's father in North Carolina. Colonel Boone, anxious to rejoin his wife and children, and feeling that Boonesboro was safe from any immediate attack by the Indians, soon after the dispersion of the savages entered again upon the long journey through the wilderness, to find his friends east of the mountains. In the autumn of 1778, Colonel Boone again found himself, after all his wonderful adventures, in a peaceful home on the banks of the Yadkin. The settlements in Kentucky continued rapidly to increase. The savages had apparently relinquished all hope of holding exclusive possession of the country. Though there were occasional acts of violence and cruelty, there was quite a truce in the Indian warfare. But the white settlers, and those who wished to emigrate, were greatly embarrassed by conflicting land claims. Many of the pioneers found their titles pronounced to be of no validity. Others who wished to emigrate experienced great difficulty in obtaining secure possession of their lands. The reputation of Kentucky as in all respects one of the most desirable of earthly regions for comfortable homes, added to the desire of many families to escape from the horrors of Revolutionary War, which was sweeping the seaboard, led to a constant tide of emigration beyond the mountains. Under these circumstances, the government of Virginia established a court, consisting of 4 prominent citizens, to go from place to place, examine such titles as should be presented to them, and to confirm those which were good. This commission commenced its duties at St. Asaph. All the old terms of settlement proposed by Henderson and the Transylvania Company were abrogated. Thus Colonel Boone had no title to a single acre of land in Kentucky. A new law, however, was enacted as follows: Any person may acquire title to so much unappropriated land as he or she may desire to purchase, on paying the consideration of £40 for every 100 acres, and so in proportion. This money was to be paid to the State treasurer, who would give for it a receipt. This receipt was to be deposited with the State auditor, who would in exchange for it give a certificate. This certificate was to be lodged at the land office. There it was to be registered, and a warrant was to be given, authorizing the survey of the land selected. Surveyors who had passed the ordeal of William and Mary College, having defined the boundaries of the land, were to make a return to the land office. A due record was there to be made of the survey. A deed was given in the name of the State, which deed was to be signed by the governor, with the seal of the Commonwealth attached. This was a perplexing labyrinth for the pioneer to pass through before he could get a title to his land. Not only Colonel Boone, but it seems that his family were anxious to return to the beautiful fields of Kentucky. During the few months he remained on the Yadkin, he was busy in converting every particle of property he possessed into money, and in raising every dollar he could for the purchase of lands he so greatly desired. The sum he obtained amounted to about $20,000, in the depreciated paper currency of that day. To Daniel Boone this was a large sum. With this the simple-hearted man started for Richmond to pay it to the State treasurer, and to obtain for it the promised certificate. He was also entrusted with quite large sums of money from his neighbors, for a similar purpose. On his way he was robbed of every dollar. It was a terrible blow to him, for it not only left him penniless, but exposed him to the insinuation of having feigned the robbery, that he might retain the money entrusted to him by his friends. Those who knew Daniel Boone well would have no more suspected him of fraud than an angel of light. With others, however, his character suffered. Rumor was busy in denouncing him. Colonel Nathaniel Hart had entrusted Boone with £2,900. This, of course, was all gone. A letter, however, is preserved from Colonel Hart, which bears noble testimony to the character of the man from whom he had suffered. I observe what you say respecting our losses by Daniel Boone. I had heard of the misfortune soon after it happened, but not of my being a partaker before now. I feel for the poor people who perhaps are to lose their preemptions, but I must say I feel more for Boone, whose character I am told suffers by it. Much degenerated must the people of this age be, when amongst them are to be found men to censure and blast the reputation of a person so just and upright, and in whose breast is a seat of virtue too pure to admit of a thought so base and dishonorable. I have known Boone in times of old, when poverty and distress had him fast by the hand, and in these wretched circumstances I have ever found him of a noble and generous soul, despising everything mean, and therefore I will freely grant him a discharge for whatever sums of mine he might have possessed at the time." Boone was now 45 years of age, but the hardships to which he had been exposed had borne heavily upon him, and he appeared 10 years older. Though he bore without a murmur the loss of his earthly all, and the imputations which were cast upon his character, he was more anxious than ever to find refuge from the embarrassments which oppressed him in the solitudes of his beautiful Kentucky. Notwithstanding his comparative poverty, his family on the banks of the Yadkin need not experience any want. Land was fertile, abundant, and cheap. He and his boys, in a few days, with their axes, could erect as good a house as they desired to occupy. The cultivation of a few acres of the soil, and the results of the chase, would provide them an ample support. Here also they could retire to rest at night, with unbolted door, and with no fear that their slumbers would be disturbed by the yell of the bloodthirsty savage. The wife and mother must doubtless have wished to remain in her pleasant home, but cheerfully and nobly she acceded to his wishes, and was ready to accompany him to all the abounding perils of the distant West. Again the family set out on its journey across the mountains. Of the incidents which they encountered we are not informed. The narrative we have from Boone is simply as follows. Our readers will excuse the slight repetition it involves. About this time I returned to Kentucky with my family, and here, to avoid an inquiry into my conduct, the reader being before informed of my bringing my family to Kentucky, I am under the necessity of informing him that during my captivity with the Indians, my wife, who despaired of ever seeing me again, had transported my family and goods back through the wilderness, amid a multitude of dangers, to her father's house in North Carolina. Shortly after the troubles at Boonesborough, I went to them and lived peaceably there until this time. The history of my going home and returning with my family forms a series of difficulties, an account of which would swell a volume, and being foreign to my purpose, I shall omit them. During Boone's absence from Kentucky, one of the most bloody battles was fought which ever occurred between the whites and the Indians. Colonel Rogers, returning with supplies, by boat, from New Orleans to the upper Ohio, when he arrived at the mouth of the Little Miami, detected the Indians in large numbers, painted, armed, and evidently on the war path, emerging from the mouth of the river in their canoes, and crossing the Ohio to the Kentucky shore. He cautiously landed his men, intending to attack the Indians by surprise. Instead of this, they turned upon him with overwhelming numbers, and assailed him with the greatest fury. Colonel Rogers and 60 of his men were almost instantly killed. This constituted nearly the whole of his party. 2 or 3 effected their escape, and conveyed the sad tidings of the massacre to the settlements. The Kentuckians were exceedingly exasperated, and resolved that the Indians should feel the weight of their vengeance. Colonel Bowman, in accordance with a custom of the times, issued a call, inviting all the Kentuckians who were willing to volunteer under his leadership for the chastisement of the Indians, to rendezvous at Harrodsburg. 300 determined men soon assembled. The expedition moved in the month of July, and commenced the ascent of the Little Miami undiscovered. They arrived in the vicinity of Old Chillicothe just before nightfall. Here it was determined so to arrange their forces in the darkness as to attack the place just before the dawn of the ensuing day. One half of the army, under the command of Colonel Logan, were to grope their way through the woods, and march around the town so as to attack it in the rear, at a given signal from Colonel Bowman, who was to place his men in position for efficient coöperation. Logan accomplished his movement, and concealing his men behind stumps, trees, and rocks, anxiously awaited the signal for attack. But the sharp ear of a watch dog detected some unusual movement, and commenced barking furiously. An Indian warrior came from his cabin and cautiously advanced the way the dog seemed to designate. As the Indian drew near, one of the party, by accident or great imprudence, discharged his gun. The Indian gave a war whoop which immediately startled all the inmates of the cabins to their feet. Logan and his party were sufficiently near to see the women and the children in a continuous line rushing over the ridge to the protection of the forest. The Indian warriors, with a military discipline hardly to be expected of them, instantly collected in several strong cabins, which were their citadels, and from whose loopholes, unexposed, they could open a deadly fire upon their assailants. In an instant the whole aspect of affairs was changed. The assailants advancing through the clearing must expose their unprotected breasts to the bullet of an unseen foe. After a brief conflict, Colonel Logan, to his bitter disappointment and that of his men, felt constrained to order a retreat. The two parties were soon reunited, having lost several valuable lives, and depressed by the conviction that the enterprise had proved an utter failure. The savages pursued, keeping up a harassing fire upon the rear of the fugitives. Fortunately for the white men, the renowned Indian chieftain Blackfish, struck by a bullet, was instantly killed. This so disheartened his followers that they abandoned the pursuit. The fugitives continued their flight all the night, and then at their leisure returned to their homes much dejected. In this disastrous expedition 9 men were killed, and 1 was severely wounded. The Indians, aided by their English allies, resolved by the invasion of Kentucky to retaliate for the invasion of Little Miami. Governor Hamilton raised a very formidable army, and supplied them with 2 pieces of artillery. By such weapons the strongest log fort could be speedily demolished, while the artillerists would be entirely beyond the reach of the guns of the garrison. A British officer, Colonel Boyd, commanded the combined force. The valley of the Licking River, along whose banks many thriving settlements had commenced, was their point of destination. A 12 days' march from the Ohio brought this army, which was considered a large one in those times, to a post called Cuddle's Station. The garrison was immediately summoned to surrender, with the promise of protection for their lives only. Resistance against artillery was hopeless. The place was surrendered. Indians and white men rushed in, alike, eager for plunder. The Indians, breaking loose from all restraint, caught men, women, and children, and claimed them as their prisoners. 3 persons who made some slight resistance were immediately tomahawked. The British commander endeavored to exonerate himself from these atrocities by saying it was utterly beyond his power to control the savages. These wolfish allies, elated by their conquest, their plunder and their captives, now demanded to be led along the valley 5 miles to the next station, called Martin's Fort. It is said that Colonel Byrd was so affected by the uncontrollable atrocities he had witnessed, that he refused to continue the expedition unless the Indians would consent, that while they should receive all the plunder, he should have all the prisoners. It is also said that notwithstanding this agreement, the same scenes were enacted at Martin's Fort which had been witnessed at Ruddle's Station. In confirmation of this statement, it is certain that Colonel Byrd refused to go any farther. All the stations on the river were apparently at his disposal, and it speaks well for his humanity that he refused to lead any farther savages, armed with the tomahawk and the scalping knife, against his white brethren. He could order a retreat, as he did, but he could not rescue the captives from those who had seized them. The Indians loaded down their victims with the plunder of their own dwellings, and as they fell by the way, sinking beneath their burdens, they buried the tomahawk in their brains. The exasperation on both sides was very great, and General Clark, who was stationed at Fort Jefferson with 1,000 picked men, entered the Indian Territory, burned the villages, destroyed the crops, and utterly devastated the country. In reference to this expedition, Mr. Cecil B. Hartley writes: "Some persons who have not the slightest objection to war, very gravely express doubts as to whether the expedient of destroying the crops of the Indians was justifiable. It is generally treated by these men as if it were a wanton display of a vindictive spirit, where in reality it was dictated by the soundest policy. For when the Indians' harvests were destroyed, they were compelled to subsist their families altogether by hunting, and had no leisure for their murderous inroads into the settlement. This result was plainly seen on this occasion, for it does not appear that the Indians attacked any of the settlements during the remainder of this year." The following incident, well authenticated, which occurred early in the spring of 1780, gives one a vivid idea of the nature of this warfare. Mr. Alexander McConnell of Lexington, while out hunting, killed a large buck. He went home for his horse to bring it in. While he was absent, 5 Indians accidentally discovered the body of the deer. Supposing the hunter would return, 3 of them hid themselves within rifle shot of the carcass, while 2 followed his trail. McConnell, anticipating no danger, was riding slowly along the path, when he was fired upon from ambush, his horse shot beneath him, and he seized as a prisoner. His captors were in high glee, and treated him with unusual kindness. His skill with the rifle excited their admiration, and as he provided them with abundance of game, they soon became quite fond of him. Day after day the savages continued their tramp to the Ohio River, to cross over to their own country. Every night they bound him very strongly. As they became better acquainted, and advanced farther from the settlements of the pioneers, they in some degree remitted their vigilance. One evening when they had arrived near the Ohio, McConnell complained so earnestly of the pain which the tightly bound cords gave him, that they more loosely fastened the cord of buffalo hide around his wrists. Still they tied it, as they supposed securely, and attached the end of the cord to the body of one of the Indians. At midnight McConnell discovered a sharp knife lying near him, which had accidentally fallen from its sheath. He drew it to him with his feet, and succeeded noiselessly in cutting the cords. Still he hardly dared to stir, for there was danger that the slightest movement might rouse his vigilant foes. The savages had stacked their 5 guns near the fire. Cautiously he crept towards them, and secreted 3 at but a short distance where they would not easily find them. He then crept noiselessly back, took a rifle in each hand, rested the muzzles upon a log, and aiming one at the heart and one at the head of the 2 Indians at the distance of a few feet, discharged both guns simultaneously. Both shots were fatal. The 3 remaining savages in bewilderment sprang to their feet. McConnell instantly seizing the 2 other guns, shot one through the heart, and inflicted a terrible wound upon the other. He fell to the ground bellowing loudly. Soon, however, he regained his feet, and hobbled off into the woods as fast as possible. The only remaining one of the party who was unhurt uttered a loud yell of terror and dismay, and bounded like a deer into the forest. McConnell was not disposed to remain even for one moment to contemplate the result of his achievement. He selected his own trusty rifle, plunged into the forest, and with the unerring instinct of the veteran hunter, in 2 days reached the garrison at Lexington to relate to them his wonderful escape. Chapter 10. Of Daniel Boone, by John S. C. Abbott. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Allyson Hester. Chapter 10. British Allies. It was in the autumn of the year 1780 that Daniel Boone with his family returned to Boonesborough. A year before, the legislature of Virginia had recognized essentially what is now Kentucky as one of the counties of Virginia. and had established the town of Boonesborough as its capital. By this act Daniel Boone was named one of the trustees or selectmen. Town lots were ordered to be surveyed, and a very liberal grant of land was conferred upon every one who would erect a house at least 16 feet square, with either brick, stone, or dirt chimney. For some reason Colonel Boone declined this office. It is probable that he was disgusted by his own experience in the civil courts. There was little danger now of an attack upon Boonesborough by the Indians. There were so many settlements around it that no foe could approach without due warning and without encountering serious opposition. On the 6th of October, Daniel Boone, with his brother Squire, left the fort alone for what would seem to be an exceedingly imprudent excursion, so defenseless, to the Blue Licks. They reached the Licks in safety. While there, they were discovered by a party of Indians, and were fired upon from ambush. Squire Boone was instantly killed and scalped. Daniel, heart-stricken by the loss of his beloved brother, fled like a deer pursued by the whole band, filling the forest with their yells like a pack of hounds. The Indians had a very powerful dog with them, who, with unerring scent, followed closely in the trail of the fugitive. For 3 miles this unequal chase continued. The dog, occasionally embarrassed in his pursuit, would be delayed for a time in regaining the trail. The speed of Boone was such that the foremost of the savages was left far behind. He then, as the dog came bounding on, stopped, took deliberate aim, and shot the brute. Boone was still far from the fort, but he reached it in safety, leaving upon the Indians the impression that he bore a charmed life. He was very deeply afflicted by the death of his brother. Squire was the youngest of the sons, and the tie which bound the brothers together was unusually tender and confidential. They had shared in many perilous adventures, and for months had dwelt entirely alone in the wilderness, far away from any other society. The winter of 1780 was one of the saddest in the annals of our country. The colonial army, everywhere defeated, was in the most deplorable state of destitution and suffering. Our frontiers were most cruelly ravaged by a barbarian foe. To add to all of this, the winter was severely cold, beyond any precedent. The crops had been so destroyed by the enemy that many of the pioneers were compelled to live almost entirely upon the flesh of the buffalo. Virginia, in extending her jurisdiction over her western lands of Kentucky, now, for the sake of a more perfect military organization, divided the extensive region into 3 counties, Fayette, Lincoln, and Jefferson. General Clark was made commander-in-chief of the Kentucky militia. Daniel Boone was commissioned as lieutenant colonel of Lincoln County. The immigration into the state at this time may be inferred from the fact that the Court of Commissioners to examine land titles, at the close of its session of 7 months, had granted 3,000 claims. Its meetings had been held mainly at Boonesborough, and its labors terminated in April, 1780. During the spring, 300 barges, loaded with emigrants, were floated down the Ohio to the falls, at what is now Louisville. As we have stated, the winter had been one of the most remarkable on record. From the middle of November to the middle of February, the ground was covered with snow and ice, without a thaw. The severity of the cold was terrible. Nearly all unprotected animals perished. Even bears, buffaloes, wolves, and wild turkeys were found frozen in the woods. The starving wild animals often came near the settlement for food. For 75 years the winter of 1780 was an era to which the old men referred. Though the Indians organized no formidable raids, they were very annoying. No one could safely wander any distance from the forts. In March, 1781, several bands entered Jefferson County, and by lying in ambush, killed 4 of the settlers. Captain Whitaker, with 15 men, went in pursuit of them. He followed their trail to the banks of the Ohio. Supposing they had crossed, he and his party embarked in canoes, boldly to continue the pursuit into the Indian country. They had scarcely pushed a rod from the shore when hideous yells rose from the Indians in ambush, and a deadly fire was opened upon the canoes. 9 of the pioneers were instantly killed or wounded. The savages, having accomplished this feat, fled into the wilderness, where the party, thus weakened in numbers, could not pursue them. A small party of settlers had reared their log huts near the present site of Shelbyville. Squire Boone had been one of the prominent actors in the establishment of this little colony. Alarmed by the menaces of the savages, these few settlers decided to remove to a more secure station on Bear's Creek. On their way, they were startled by the war whoop of they knew not how many Indians concealed in ambush, and a storm of bullets fell upon them, killing and wounding many of their number. The miscreants, scarcely waiting for the return fire, fled with yells which resounded through the forest, leaving their victims to the sad task of burying the dead and nursing the wounded. Colonel Floyd collected 25 men to pursue them. The wary Indians, nearly 200 in number, drew them into an ambush and opened upon the party a deadly fire, which almost instantly killed half their number. The remainder, with great difficulty, escaped, leaving their dead to be mutilated by the scalping knife of the savage. Almost every day brought tidings of similar disasters. The Indians, emboldened by these successes, seemed to rouse themselves to a new determination to exterminate the whites. The conduct of the British government, in calling such wretches to their alliance in war with the colonies, created the greatest exasperation. Thomas Jefferson gave expression to the public sentiment in the Declaration of Independence, in which he says, in arraignment of King George III., "He has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions." There were 2 wretched men, official agents of the British government, who were more savage than the savages themselves. One of them, a vagabond named Simon Girty, had joined the Indians by adoption. He had not only acquired their habits, but had become their leader in the most awful scenes of ferocity. He was a Tory, and as such was the bitterest foe of the colonists, who were struggling for independence. The other, Colonel McGee, with a little more respectability of character, was equally fiend-like in exciting the Indians to the most revolting barbarities. Thus incited and sustained by British authority, the Indians kept all the settlers in Kentucky in constant alarm. Instigated by the authorities at Detroit, the warriors of 5 tribes assembled at Old Chillicothe to organize the most formidable expedition which had as yet invaded Kentucky. These tribes were the Shawnees on the Little Miami, the Cherokees on the Tennessee, the Wyandots on the Sandusky, the Tawas on the Maumee, and the Delawares on the Muskingum. Their choicest warriors, 500 in number, rendezvoused at Old Chillicothe. This Indian village was built in the form of a square, enclosing a large area. Some of their houses were of logs, some of bark, some of reeds filled in with clay. Boone says that the Indians concentrated their utmost force and vengeance upon this expedition, hoping to destroy the settlements and depopulate the country at a single blow. Not far from Boonesborough, in the same valley of Kentucky, there was a small settlement called Bryant's Station. William Bryant, the founder, had married a sister of Colonel Boone. On the 15th of August, a war party of 500 Indians and Canadians, under the leadership of Simon Girty, appeared before this little cluster of log huts, each of which was of course bullet-proof. The settlers fought heroically. Girty was wounded, and 30 of his band were killed, while the garrison lost but 4. The assailing party, thus disappointed in their expectation of carrying the place by storm, and fearing the arrival of reinforcements from other settlements, hastily retired. Colonel Boone, hearing of the attack, hastened to the rescue, joining troops from several of the adjacent forts. The party consisted of 180 men, under the leadership of Colonel Todd, one of nature's noblemen. Colonel Boone seems to have been second in command. 2 of his sons, Israel and Samuel accompanied their father upon this expedition. The Indians, led by British officers, were far more to be dreaded than when left to their own cunning, which was often childish. As the little band of pioneers, rushing to the rescue, approached Bryant's Station and were informed of the retreat of the invaders, a council of war was held, to decide whether it were best for 180 men to pursue 500 Indians and Canadians, through a region where every mile presented the most favorable opportunities for concealment and ambush. Girty was a desperado who was to be feared as well as hated. Contrary to the judgment of both Colonels Todd and Boone, it was decided to pursue the Indians. There was no difficulty in following the trail of so large a band, many of whom were mounted. Their path led almost directly north, to the Licking River, and then followed down its banks towards the Ohio. As the pursuers were cautiously advancing, they came to a remarkable bend in the stream, where there was a large and open space, with prairie grass very high. A well trampled buffalo track led through this grass, which was almost like a forest of reeds. Along this street the Indians had retreated. The scouts who had been sent forward to explore returned with the report that there were no signs of Indians, and yet 400 savages had so adroitly concealed themselves that their line really extended from bank to bank of the river, where it bent like a horseshoe before them. The combined cunning of the Indian, and the intelligence of their white leaders, was now fatally enlisted for the destruction of the settlers. 180 men were to be caught in a trap, while 500 demons prepared to shoot them down. As soon as Colonel Todd's party passed the neck of this bend, the Indians closed in behind them, rose from their concealment, and with terrific yells opened upon them a still more terrific fire. The pioneers fought with the courage of desperation. At the first discharge, nearly 1/3 of Colonel Todd's party fell dead or wounded. Struck fatally by several bullets, Colonel Todd himself fell from his horse drenched with blood. While a portion of the Indians kept up with fire, the others, with hideous yells, sprang forward with tomahawk and scalping knife, completing their fiend-like work. It was a scene of awful confusion and dismay. The survivors, fighting every step of the way, retreated towards the river, for there was no escape back through their thronging foes. Colonel Boone's 2 sons fought by the side of their father. Samuel, the younger, struck by a bullet, was severely but not mortally wounded. Israel, his 2nd son, fell dead. The unhappy father took his dead boy upon his shoulders to save him from the scalping knife. As he tottered beneath the bleeding body, an Indian of Herculean stature with uplifted tomahawk rushed upon him. Colonel Boone dropped the body of his son, shot the Indian through the heart, and seeing the savages rushing upon him from all directions, fled, leaving the corpse of his boy to its fate. Being intimately acquainted with the ground, he plunged into a ravine, baffling several parties who pursued him, swam across the river, and entering the forest succeeded in escaping from his foes, and at length safely by a circuitous route returned to Bryant's Station. In the meantime, the scene of tumult and slaughter was awful beyond all description. Victors and vanquished were blended together upon the banks of the stream. In this dreadful conflict there were 4 Indians to each white man. There was a narrow ford at the spot, but the whole stream seemed clogged, some swimming and some trying to wade, while the exultant Indians shot and tomahawked without mercy. Those who succeeded in crossing the river, leaving the great buffalo track which they had been following, plunged into the thickets, and though vigorously pursued by the Indians, most of them eventually reached the settlements. In this dreadful disaster, the colonists lost 60 men in killed, and 7 were taken prisoners. The Indians, in counting up their loss, found that 64 were missing. In accordance with their barbaric custom, they selected in vengeance 4 of the prisoners and put them to death by the most terrible tortures which savage ingenuity could devise. Had Colonel Boone's advice been followed, this calamity might have been avoided. Still, characteristically, he uttered not a word of complaint. In his comments upon the event, he says: "I cannot reflect upon this dreadful scene but sorrow fills my heart. A zeal for the defense of their country led these heroes to the scene of action, though with a few men to attack a powerful army of experienced warriors. When we gave way, they pursued us with the utmost eagerness, and in every quarter spread destruction. The river was difficult to cross, and many were killed in the flight, some just entering the river, some in the water, others after crossing, in ascending the cliffs. Some escaped on horseback, a few on foot, and being dispersed everywhere in a few hours, brought the melancholy news of this unfortunate conflict to Lexington. The reader may guess what sorrow filled the hearts of the inhabitants, exceeding anything I am able to describe. Being reinforced, we returned to bury the dead, and found their bodies strewed everywhere, cut and mangled in a dreadful manner. This mournful scene exhibited a horror almost unparalleled. Some torn and eaten by wild beasts, those in the river eaten by fishes, all in such a putrefied condition that no one could be distinguished from another." This battle of Blue Licks, as it is called, occupies one of the most mournful pages in the history of Kentucky. The escape of Boone adds another to the extraordinary adventures of this chivalric and now sorrow-stricken man. Colonel Boone communicated an official report to the Governor of Virginia, Benjamin Harrison, father of William Henry Harrison, subsequently President of the United States. In this report it is noticeable that Boone makes no allusion whatever to his own services. This modest document throws such light upon the character of this remarkable man and upon the peril of the times, that it merits full insertion here. It is as follows: "Boone's Station, Fayette County, August 30th, 1782. "Sir: Present circumstances of affairs cause me to write to your Excellency as follows: On the 16th instant, a large body of Indians, with some white men, attacked one of our frontier stations, known as Bryant's Station. The siege continued from about sunrise until 2 o'clock of the next day, when they marched off. Notice being given to neighboring stations, we immediately raised 181 horsemen, commanded by Colonel John Todd, including some of the Lincoln County militia, and pursued about 40 miles. After a brief account of the battle which we have already given, he continues: Afterwards we were reinforced by Colonel Logan, which made our force 460 men. We marched again to the battle ground, but finding the enemy had gone, we proceeded to bury the dead. We found 43 on the ground, and many lay about which we could not stay to find, hungry and weary as we were, and dubious that the enemy might not have gone off quite. By the sign, we thought that the Indians exceeded 400, while the whole of the militia of the county does not amount to more than 130. From these facts, your Excellency may form an idea of our situation. I know that your own circumstances are critical, but are we to be wholly forgotten? I hope not. I trust that about 500 men may be sent to our assistance immediately. If these shall be stationed as our county lieutenant shall deem necessary, it may be the means of saving our part of the country. But if they are placed under the direction of General Clark, they will be of little or no service to our settlement. The falls lie 100 miles west of us, and the Indians northeast, while our men are frequently called to protect them. I have encouraged the people in this county all that I could, but I can no longer justify them or myself to risk our lives here, under such extraordinary hazards. The inhabitants of this county are very much alarmed at the thoughts of the Indians bringing another campaign into our country this fall. If this should be the case, it will break up these settlements. I hope, therefore, that your Excellency will take the matter into your consideration, and send us some relief as quick as possible. These are my sentiments, without consulting any person. Colonel Logan will I expect immediately send you an express, by whom I humbly request your Excellency's answer. In the meantime, I remain yours, etc., Daniel Boone. General Clark, who was the military leader of Kentucky under the colonial government, was established at the Falls. The British authorities held their headquarters at Detroit, from which post they were sending out their Indian allies in all directions to ravage the frontiers. General Clark was a man of great energy of character, and he was anxious to organize an expedition against Detroit. With this object in view, he had by immense exertions assembled a force of nearly 2,000 men. Much to his chagrin, he received orders to remain at the Falls for the present, to protect the frontiers then so severely menaced. But when the tidings reached him of the terrible disaster at Blue Lick, he resolved to pursue the Indians and punish them with the greatest severity. The exultant savages had returned to Old Chillicothe, and had divided their spoil and their captives. Colonel Boone was immediately sent for to take part in this expedition. Clark's army crossed the Ohio, and marching very rapidly up the banks of the Little Miami, arrived within 2 miles of Chillicothe before they were discovered. On perceiving the enemy, the Indians scattered in all directions. Men, women and children fled into the remote forest, abandoning their homes and leaving everything behind them. The avenging army swept the valley with fire and ruin. Their corn just ripening, and upon which they mainly relied for their winter supply of food, was utterly destroyed. Every tree which bore any fruit was felled, and 5 of their towns were laid in ashes. The trail of the army presented a scene of utter desolation. The savages were alike astonished and dismayed. They had supposed that the white men, disheartened by their dreadful defeat at the Blue Lick, would abandon the country. Instead of that, with amazing recuperative power, they had scarcely reached their homes ere another army, utterly resistless in numbers, is burning their towns and destroying their whole country. This avenging campaign so depressed the Indians that they made no farther attempt for the organized invasion of Kentucky. The termination of the war with England also deprived them of their military resources, and left them to their own unaided and unintelligent efforts. Still miserable bands continued prowling around, waylaying and murdering the lonely traveler, setting fire to the solitary hut, and inflicting such other outrages as were congenial with their cruel natures. It thus became necessary for the pioneers always to live with the rifle in hand. Colonel Boone had become especially obnoxious to the Indians. Twice he had escaped from under them, under circumstances which greatly mortified their vanity. They recognized the potency of his rifle in the slaughter of their own warriors at the Blue Lick, and they were well aware that it was his sagacity which led the army of General Clark in its avenging march through their country. It thus became with them an object of intense desire to take him prisoner, and had he been taken, he would doubtless have been doomed to the severest torture they could inflict. Mr. Peck, in his interesting life of Boone, gives the following account of one of the extraordinary adventures of this man, which he received from the lips of Colonel Boone himself. On one occasion 4 Indians suddenly appeared before his cabin and took him prisoner. Though the delicacy of Colonel Boone's organization was such, that he could never himself relish tobacco in any form, he still raised some for his friends and neighbors, and for what were then deemed the essential rites of hospitality. As a shelter for curing the tobacco, he had built an enclosure of rails about 12 feet in height, and covered with canes and grass. Stalks of tobacco are generally split and strung on sticks about 4 feet in length. The ends of these are laid on poles, placed across the tobacco house, and in tiers, one above another, to the roof. Boone had fixed his temporary shelter in such a manner as to have 3 tiers. He had covered the lower tier, and the tobacco had become dry. When he entered the shelter for the purpose of removing the sticks to the upper tier, preparatory to gathering the remainder of the crop, he had hoisted up the sticks from the lower to the second tier, and was standing on the poles which supported it, while raising the sticks to the upper tier, when 4 stout Indians, with guns, entered the low door and called him by name. "Now, Boone, we got you. You no get away more. We carry you off to Chillicothe this time. You no cheat us any more." Boone looked down upon their upturned faces, saw their loaded guns pointed at his breast, and recognizing some of his old friends the Shawanese, who had made him prisoner near Blue Licks in 1778, coolly and pleasantly responded, "Ah, old friends, glad to see you." Perceiving that they manifested impatience to have him come down, he told them he was quite willing to go with them, and only begged that they would wait where they were and watch him closely until he could finish removing the tobacco. While thus parleying with them, Boone inquired earnestly respecting his old friends in Chillicothe. He continued for some time to divert the attention of these simple minded men by allusions to past events with which they were familiar, and by talking of his tobacco, his mode of curing it, and promising them an abundant supply. With their guns in their hands, however, they stood at the door of the shed, grouped closely together so as to render his escape apparently impossible. In the meantime Boone carefully gathered his arms full of the long dry tobacco leaves, filled with pungent dust, which would be blinding and stifling as the most powerful snuff, and then with a leap from his station 12 feet high, came directly upon their heads, filling their eyes and nostrils, and so bewildering and disabling them for the moment, that they lost all self-possession and all self-control. Boone, agile as a deer, darted out at the door, and in a moment was in his bullet-proof log hut, which to him was an impregnable citadel. Loopholes guarded every approach. The Indians could not show themselves without exposure to certain death. They were too well acquainted with the unerring aim of Boone's rifle to venture within its range. Keeping the log cabin between them and their redoubtable foe, the baffled Indians fled into the wilderness. Colonel Boone related this adventure with great glee, imitating the gestures of the bewildered Indians. He said that notwithstanding his narrow escape, he could not resist the temptation, as he reached the door of his cabin, to look around to witness the effect of his achievement. The Indians, coughing, sneezing, blinded and almost suffocated by the tobacco dust, were throwing out their arms and groping about in all directions, cursing him for a rogue and calling themselves fools. CHAPTER XI.